Pallavi, hi, good to have you with us. How have you been?
I'm great. How have you been?
I'm doing well, Pallavi. I think these are interesting times, right? And I think no reason not to be excited. But like I said, right, it's good to have you with us. And this is a conversation that I was looking forward to for a variety of reasons. One, we're doing it in Women's Day, right? So it becomes exclusive at many levels as far as that is concerned. I very firmly believe that more and more women need to be part of the workforce and really sort of be leading it. And as a professional, you've been somebody who's really seen the markets transition, right? And across sectors. That's very, very interesting, right? There are not a lot of people who possibly have the kind of experience that you would have, right? And India being a complicated market that it is, this becomes an important conversation at many levels, right? We had a changed economy. I think 2020 has been very unreal for us. There are some people who are very excited that we're essentially moving into a homogeneous environment that makes us a little more predictable. My sense is we're entering a phase of madness, and I think the job of marketers is going to be just so much more important in the process, right? Communication is going to be so much more important. Agility in communication is going to be so much more important, right? So I think with that, this becomes an important conversation. But before we do that, right, I'd love you to introduce yourself. I have had the opportunity of knowing, your body of work. A lot of people are going to be possibly listening to you for the first time. For them, I think it'll be a good start. Over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for setting the context so well. So I've been in the automotive sector for almost 15 years.
Right.
But I think the phase when I started my work was, there was a tipping point when super biking actually was coming into the foray of the market, right? So I started with Yamaha, moved to Harley Davidson, one brand which I always say that, my blood is orange and black for life. Because it just does that for you. Because, there are people who say that once you ride a Harley Davidson, you cannot go back. It's just tough. That's why there's a saying which says, four wheels move your body, but two wheels move your soul. And I think I firmly believe that. And I think at Harley, because it was setting up, the headquarters in India, and that's the time the big, superbike market was coming into the country. A lot of people who wanted to do different things, wanted to just have me time, which was not there, whether, a man or a woman or gender neutral, anybody who wanted to really do something for themselves, there wasn't that escapism in some way. Right? And I think motorcycling did that for a lot of people. I still remember, we started doing India Bike Week, which was in Goa, and people would come up and say that you guys have changed our life. And I think that's not work. That just takes you to another level of, there's a sense of happiness, which you can't, your work becomes your passion. And I was there for almost 8 years from a founding member, and then, launching a motorcycle like a Street 750. We launched almost close to 20 models, and Street was manufactured, built for India, for the world. So it was a global product. So everything had to be done by the India team. So I think that to me is a great badge of honor for a lot of people who worked at Harley at the time. And then, of course, I wanted to do something else, especially in the technology side and how cars are shaping in the mobility side of the business. And then MG was coming, and nobody knew MG. What is MG, right? A lot of people thought maybe, it's, I don't know what it is, what brand it is. So it was a big pun I took, and I said, I really want to do it because I really believe that doing something from scratch, painting a canvas which has nothing is a different high, and you get to build your own team. You get to do things which a normal big company will sometimes not allow you to do it. You can't experiment so much. So, sorry, you were saying something?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. So, and then MG came in, and I think the biggest task for us was there wasn't any legacy. There weren't any systems. It's a British brand, but owned by Chinese. And we had to really establish it as a technology first company. So everything from, your CRM, your GMS, your CMS, everything from a technology perspective had to be customer first, but more importantly, simple. Don't make the customer's life. Often technology can make it complicated, and it had to be very, very simple. And I think we were able to do it, and I had a great team of people. And I think that's the reason MG has been able to do what they have done with all the AI and technology. And then, of course, there are two brands, even if we've all, studied in our MBA days or acquaintances or people
Right.
who talk about brands, two brands you want to work if you're an automotive buff. Harley Davidson and second is BMW.
Right.
So, and then they reached out with a very specific problem. Again, data was their problem. They wanted know your customer very, very specifically. I think
Right.
marketing now has a lot of legs. It's not
Absolutely.
just about building a brand, but it's totally about how do you add growth and revenue to your business. And
Right.
that's the major shift which has happened, I think, post-pandemic, but also was happening because of digitalization. And it was a very interesting journey. I think for me, a great learning how to work with Germans have a very different way of working
Right.
and fantastic set of people. We built and did some amazing stuff during the pandemic.
Right.
So overall, I think it's been a hell of a ride for me, but it's only, it's only been like that because of great mentors, great team members, because work process, campaigns, technology, all of this can come in play if you have a great team. If you don't have a
Right.
great team, you can't do anything. Technology is an enabler. It cannot be everything, right?
Absolutely.
So that's been a journey so far. I hope I didn't take so long.
Interesting. No, you didn't, right? And I think technology, and I say this classically across a lot of my conversations, right? Especially when I'm doing it with founders or startups, right? That the team is the only constant, right? Because the market side dynamics are really not in your control, right? I think that attitude and attitude, in terms of how you approach the problem that arises, and in a market like that, there are umpteen, right? And it's just such a difficult market to kind of stare in, right? It's critical to have a great team, right? But I particularly like, Pallavi, the way you, and when you kind of talk about Harley, right? One can sense that passion, right? One can sense that energy. And I think the way you beautifully picked up the me time, which is so delicate as a and so personal to an individual, could be a man, could be a woman, right? And weaved it in with a biking experience is phenomenal, right? I think those are some standout pieces, and through the course of conversation, we're going to talk more about how such things come together, right? What's possibly the process behind the madness, if I can call it that. But Pallavi, I'm gonna move into a question, right? Which is going to be slightly more macro in this conversation, right? Because like I said, right, you're somebody who has the kind of experience to dissect and tackle those issues, right? Which are possibly going to help many people who are going to be watching this, right? So I would straight jump into a question, which is going to be that of around COVID, right? And now this has been an unreal moment, right? And I think our conversation is complete without talking of COVID. Um, it's changed us, right? As consumers, it's changed the possibility for brands. It's changed how we consume. We've become knowledge first in many ways, right? We become knowledge first and information first in many ways, right? The responsibility and the ability for brands to go out and communicate is just so much more cumbersome, right? And so much more complex. While of course, everybody's available in the same medium, differentiation has become a challenge. How do you view this, right? I'd love to understand how are you looking at this phase in the current context.
Yeah, no, I think brilliant question. Let's divide this into phases. If
Sure.
you look at, I'm just doing it from somebody who would want to understand this more deeply. If
Sure.
you look pre-COVID era, right, lots of things were changing. It's not
Right.
that brand clutter wasn't happening. It was becoming very difficult for brands to differentiate themselves apart from the product they sell. Yeah, because consumer is becoming much and much aware, and you can't fool them because of so much
Sure.
information available on internet, right? So the brands who were up there, who wanted to make a change, were already in the game and they were making change. Hence, it took them very less time to adapt when COVID hit, right? Now, there were brands who were not so okay to actually go a route which is clearly focus on, if I were to say, a phygital experience, right? Or a
Sure.
digital experience now, or an omni-channel experience, which did not include physical appearances or physical, meeting or talking, because
Sure.
there are brands who can't do it. Like if you look at a luxury brand, right? You won't go into you won't buy a Louis Vuitton, or you won't buy a M4 or a Mercedes S-Class just online. It becomes, because it's a high purchase, it's a high indulgence product. So I think it's the strategy for COVID-19, and if I were to say this from my experience, was the teams which were agile, the processes which were not too complicated, and third most important thing, the willingness to take a risk and say, it's okay if we fail, let's do this differently. Because any which ways, the norm had to become different because consumer is much smarter than we thinking in the companies that we are. We are not that smart, right? Because consumer is actually consuming content of all brands. They just don't buy our brand, right? Hospitality in our country has changed experience to next level, right? There are such amazing hotels like Postcard Hotels or the Oberoi properties. They spoil customers and they expect the same experience. Or Amazon, for example, is like click of a button, you get everything. Why can't I get this for other brands? There is a question, right? So like that's why I said that I think the brands who've been able to do some amazing stuff and a clutter breaking stuff during pandemic time are agile teams, clear processes, simple, but more importantly, let's take risks and let's make this happen. And I think they've been able to actually sell more, save more, because you're not spending so much on like a television or a physical experience or an out of home and things like that. Not that digital is cheap. There's this mindset that digital, do everything on digital, it's cheap. Actually, it's not, because there is a way to talk to a customer in a very personalized way through digital platforms, and that is expensive because you have to build tech platforms for that. You can't just throw in an ad and say, this customer is my customer. You have to really, kind of nurture the customer to then ensure that the consumer becomes a fan to then a customer. And that to me is a journey which has to be undertaken with a lot of compassion for the user.
Interesting. Pallavi, when you say what you say, right, and I'm breaking it down, right, at a brand level, I'm just kind of thinking, right, now 2020 has also been a year where a lot of D2C brands, for example, have come up, right? I think brand managers and in general entrepreneurs have been extremely smart to dissect, the overall purchase experience in say two halves or three pieces, right? Where the engagement continues to happen in a digital medium. And then there's an experiential side to it, right? When you look at older world organizations or, and larger organizations in a pre-2020 era, all of this was sort of bundled up together, right? So you typically have these stores, people are going to walk in, they'll experience it, and possibly that will translate into purchase, right? And then there would be like a very cumbersome process of, keep following it up, right? Sorry, I'm digressing from pure marketing into sales, right? Because I think the role is now kind of coming together. I think CMOs are going to be revenue heads in many ways for the changing organizations, the landscape, right? To how it's happening today. I mean, so you have brands like Lenskart, right? Where you can actually go and shop and do like a bunch of those things, right? Now, those are brands that were digital first anyway, right? When you think of the older world organizations, right? So, for example, the HULs of the world, right? The FMCG organizations of the world. A lot of this experience was essentially, there was advertising, which was fairly one-way communication, right? It'll get word delivered. If you like it, you buy it. There was no engagement per se. I think it was largely dependent on the availability of the product at last mile, right? If you look at the newer age brands, right, now they have used these mediums phenomenally, right? They've been extremely agile with their communication, something that we kind of talked about, right? And they're less bureaucratic when you look at vis-a-vis large organizations, right? Because there is a certain narrative that these organizations, especially if they're MNCs, they want a consistency narrative that gets built out across markets, right? Do you think going forward, we are in for a very different kind of a run, right? While there could be a team which is highly motivated, which wants to go out and, is roaring and geared to conquer, but because, you have to have internal approvals, there are systems in place, it just delays pace, right? You cannot be as quick as say a startup is, right? So do you think the narrative of the market is kind of changing? Do you think the consumer is split? Or do you think brands that have been built over a period of time will still have some possibility because of the trust that they've kind of established and created in the process? I'd love to understand that, right? Where is the market headed? Where is the consumer headed? Given that you work with legacy brands and, you possibly have experienced a lot of newer age brands, right, up close and personal. I'd love to understand where are we headed as a market, as a country, which is now, of course, we've been young, right, but also aspirational disposable capitals are increasing. Savings is increased, right, largely because we've been locked up. There's a lot of that movement which is happening. We've become experimentational, right, in the process. It's very, very complex. Where are we on that front? I'd love to understand.
So I think it's a very large question. So let me try and divide it. So I think there's a lot happening in the world at this point. With the war between Russia and Ukraine, the oil prices, the stock market is going haywire. So it is very difficult at this point to predict what's going to happen, right? But said that, I think the question which you raised on legacy brand and new age brands, there are two very clear, for a decade, the industries which are going to be forefronting in some ways to make the change for the India market, and which is going to bring in a lot of capital or revenue, maybe coming from other parts of the world, or also investments coming within India. There are two things which I think, one is the mobility space, right? And when I say mobility space, especially the EV space. And second is the consumer technology space. And when I say the EV space, fairly, yesterday I was judging Car and Bike Awards, and it was amazing in the two-wheeler category. 5 of them who we shortlisted were actually startups from India, and they were all EV. And it was so heartwarming to see that, there are, and the amount of passion they have to actually make this change, not dependent on the government, but depending on how we can make a great product and actually build a product like that with accessories, which is sustainable, which does not need a bigger investment. There are brands, I was so impressed with the simple, of course, Ether has done some phenomenal work. And what I really like about brands who are startups, they are very, they have a very simple way of communication. They don't over communicate. And I think that's the worst thing you can do. If you don't have a product at this point, which consumer can use, but you just keep communicating just to get eyeballs, that's the worst you can do. And that's been a trend for few years, just to get a lot of PR and a lot of attention without really having any metal. Really show the metal to the consumer. Let the consumer talk. Let there be conversations. And that's the huge difference I see with startups who understand by the end of the day, you're selling a product. You have to make money. Right? It's not just about getting attention or eyeballs. And there are a lot of big startups who have a lot of funding. I won't name them, but they're just going all over the place, right? But they don't have a clear product go-to-market strategy. Now with legacy brands, I think the concern I see is that it's not, their good part or their positive part for legacy brand is that they know how to do things in a long format, but in an efficient way, which will sustain longer, right? That's a good positive point of them. So they do everything which is in the sphere of legal, right? And that is very important because India is a complicated market. It's not easy. And with legacy brands, still there is a lot of trust. See, if you want to buy today any car, the first car, you always still think a Maruti or a Hyundai. Why? They build trust over 25 years. So even if you're a new startup, you have lots of money, but if you're thinking, let me buy a car, the first car for my mother, you will still say, let me pick up a Hyundai. Better service, better this, better that. You would still, take some time because it's how human brain functions. And Indians, we guys are very emotional. No matter whatever comes in, we are still a very emotional country. We are a family-driven country. People like us who live in metros, we are 2% of our country. 2% or 0.5%.
Interesting.
95% of our people still they still want, that trust. Will I be taken care of? Will this happen or not? Yes, it's changing. It definitely is changing, but they still want that the organization is able to give them that trust, which is important.
That consistency.
There has to be. maybe consistency, but trust is, I think, as Indians, is very, very critical. But
Right.
the negative side for legacy brand, I think, is the way the world is changing. If they don't adapt faster, they don't hire talent from different walks of life and young talent.
Right.
That is critical, which I don't see that much still. If you look at an FMCG or you look at auto today, brands which are making difference for the country, where employment is large, right? FMCG employs so many people.
Sure.
Automotive employs a lot of people because of factories and all of that. But today you see people on top management still are very old school, I have to say. I'm sorry, I'm saying, but they are old school because, and it's
I
not
agree
that.
with you.
I'm not saying any disrespect to them. They bring a lot of experience. But the way the world is changing, you really need people who are ready to take risks, who are ready to say, it's okay if we fail once, but let's keep trying. And we have lots of examples. Ether is one great example. Nika is a great example. Lenskart is a great example.
Right.
You have a lot of brands who are coming
You
in
know,
and saying, yeah.
Pallavi, I'd like to substantiate that, right? I mean, I have a little daughter, right? And I've already started to feel that I'm out of place, right? I don't think in the next couple of years I'll possibly in a position to decide for her because the preferences are changing, right? The markets have become so much more dynamic, right? So a lot of this experience that we kind of continue to talk about, and I understand where you're coming from, right? I mean, I think India is kind of transitioning into being a homogeneous market. We're still not there, right? So a lot of that experience is still important, right? But is that going to be relevant in a couple of years? I have my doubts, and I kind of completely concur with what you're saying, right? And that's what you're essentially alluding to, right? That there is no space for egos and legacy anymore, right? The consumers shifted, right? That market is in a different terrain. The habits are different. The ownership structures are going to be different. The availability of, for example, resources and capital is going to be very, very different, right? In certain cases, it's going to be consistent. In certain cases, it's going to be inconsistent, right? Which means that your models are going to be up for a challenge in any case, right? You rather beef up than succumb to the complexities, right? Pallavi, on that note, now one thing that has happened, right, and I'm sure we will agree on this one together, right? And I think this is a large part of your job, right? Is to continue to look at a lot of content, right? And especially last 2 years, content, I mean, it's been overwhelming, right? Look at the kind of times that we've been spending. It's gone up 3x. Our kids are hooked up on devices, right? It's becoming overwhelming. We're just very quickly consuming a lot of content, right? And more is more is about what my thesis in philosophy is when you talk of content, right? Every single brand is doing it. Certain brands are doing it beautifully. Certain brands are kind of confused. But overall, the sense is that you'll have to be out there and communicate, right? There cannot be long gaps between how you engage with your consumers, right? Now, this is becoming complex, right? Because the arbitrage between brand A and brand B is all now become very predictable, right? Because you have analytics, you have clear water like softwares which help you understand the consumer behavior and their search trend and tendencies just so much more clearly, right? Then you just have to sort of optimize it creatively. Even there, AI is kind of now coming in and filling it, right? What I want to understand, but there are people who are steering all of this, right? By using all of this information, right? Just putting the creative concept together. Creativity is something which will really differentiate how brand A functions vis-a-vis brand B, right? And that's possibly going to establish the trust that you kind of mentioned of, right? How beautifully do you communicate? Can you touch that emotional chord or not, right? Can you factor in those, say, regional nuances, that cultural aspects that help somebody buy better and buy faster? Because ROI is just so much more important, right? You cannot have long tail purchase cycles, right? Transaction has to happen much faster, right? If one is to institutionalize this process, what do you think is the way forward? And I think you're possibly in the best position to do that, right? I'd love to hear from you in terms of if a founder is to do it, right? If a business manager is to do it, right? If a leader is to do it, how should they kind of dissect in a market which is just overwhelmed with information, right? And the consumers are engaging with that information by default. How would you think, or how do you think should they institutionalize this process of bringing in more and more creative intelligence into their ability to communicate better?
Yeah. So I think there are two things, in my view, to be done. First is there has to be a clear framework.
Sure.
When you don't have a framework is when you go everywhere, which means your competitor is trying to do something. Oh my God, they've put up this and we don't have it. Let's do it. And
Right.
that's when you don't have a framework, and that I feel having a framework where you know what your brand purpose is.
Sure.
In today's day and age, I think the brand purpose has become more important than anything else. A
Right.
brand purpose could be very different for every brand, but
Sure.
once you have that, then it becomes very easy, whether you're a manager or you're a founder, or do you have a new product or a campaign to launch, or a differentiated idea to go to market. If you have that, then you know, and there is a whole framework to it, right? What are your truths for your brand? What's your brand
Mhm.
purpose? You know, all of
Right.
that exists. So basically, a brand house, right? I think that's very, very critical to build. And that takes a lot of time. That takes months to crack. It's not
Right.
easy. And it's not a work of an agency.
Right.
It's a work of real people sitting who understand, they use their product, who've spoken to consumers. An agency can't do it.
Right.
You have to get your hands dirty. You cannot expect to pay money and do it. I think that cannot happen. And
Right.
second to me is, I think, if you look the era of the 90s, we all
Mhm.
studied the 4 Ps.
Sure.
And then, the 2000 came in and there were 4 Cs, which was communication, content, all of
Right.
that. I think now is 4 Is.
Right.
This and the next decade is all about insight, intel, impact you are making. And
Right.
if you're able to build the framework around your brand purpose, and
Mhm.
most importantly around the 4 Is, which is intel and insight and all of that, it'll become extremely, it won't be still easy, because
Mhm.
it takes time for a new brand or an existing brand to change their strategy. But
Right.
once you have like the canvas, which has a clear way of looking towards the market, the go-to-market
Sure.
strategy, it becomes easy, because
Mhm.
ultimately we are all people, right? You are
Sure.
different from me, I'm different from the
Right.
other person, and of
Sure.
course we all have egos. So everybody, it's human nature to think my idea is the best idea. However
Interesting.
said that, you may, when you have a framework, then you work as per the framework. Then it's not about
Right.
Ashu or it's not about Pallavi. It's about that framework,
Sure.
and that builds, and I think that builds great constructive dialogue. It
Interesting.
builds great teamwork.
Right.
And it's when there's constructive dialogue, then you're having intelligent conversations.
Right.
And that to me, I think in India is becoming more important, because we are driven by emotions. It's great to be emotional, but I
Right.
think in business, you can't be emotional. You have to get your job
Interesting.
done. You have to get
Right.
business coming into your company. So gone are the day when oh my god, it's a great creative and you get this great I don't I think you need to look at it and say, okay, how will this process, or how will this lead to some amount of numbers? And I'm saying
Right.
numbers is not sales, but numbers in terms of has your engagement
Engagement.
increased, has
Right.
your and engagement to the right consumer, not like just like that,
All over.
yeah.
Right.
And to me, digital has kind of made it very confusing for people.
Right.
And that's why I feel that people sitting on the key decision makers have to get more educated.
Right.
They need to understand that how these platforms work, so that they can have intelligent conversations with people who know better than them,
Right.
which are their teams.
Interesting.
And another thing I personally feel, and I believe, and I always did that, hire people who are smarter than you.
Right.
Because ultimately, if your organization wins, everybody's going to win. It's not going to be Ashu winning and rest everybody not winning.
Right.
It is everybody together. And that to me, the key change will happen when key decision makers, people who sit on the top seats, are actually saying, I want to learn this. I want to know how you guys do this. I'm going to get my hands dirty, even if it means I need to understand how a CPM work or how CRM work, but I need to know it. But they will never do it,
Right.
but they have to learn,
But
because this is the thing which your consumers are doing all the time.
interesting. But don't you think that's a wish for an ideal world? We don't live in an ideal world, right? We essentially live in a world where people have a lot of insecurities, right? I mean, it's easier said than done, right? Hiring smarter people than yourself. I mean, who wants to build internal competition, right? Where their own decisions are challenged, right? But that's a discussion for a different time, Pallavi. But I think what you've kind of kind of alluded to in a certain form and way is a very pertinent point. I think what you're highlighting is that the DNA has to be constructed in a certain form and way, right? And if you get the foundation right, which could be in form of a matrix or a plan of action which is driven by purpose and which knows its customer, right? You can build many other dimensions around it, right? Which just helps you assess the impact that you've created with every single such campaign in a better way, right? And it could be done more creatively, right? But I think the engineering is something which is just so much more important, right? Creativity thrives on a strong foundation which has very clear purpose, objective, and intent. Pallavi, there is another point that you kind of highlighted in this particular answer that you gave us, right? And that was a point which essentially, highlighted the choice of medium. Now, you have across all of your experience and today, pretty much experienced the impact that a brand has been able to uh, kind of generate, across various parameters, that of engagement, ROI, so on and so forth, right? To an extent of conversion cycles. Um, if I am to ask you, right, what possibly is your choice of medium today? I mean, of course, it's a very cliched question in many ways, right? But I would love to understand why and how of the choice that you're making, right? Do you think that one-way communication, times for one-way communication is over, or do you think there's still some possibility and it could be used strategically? It's going to be a hybrid approach that we'll have to take, which is going to be that of digital plus, say, OOH and other mediums. Where are we on that front, right? Because that's becoming another big complexity and a complication for a lot of people, right? All large, all newer businesses, right? Even irrespective of the size, right? They're essentially all calibrated to acquiring in just about certain mediums, right? So it's basically Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, right? The social media pieces that have come up, right? Which is just kind of squeezing it out and becoming far more expensive for each one of them. What's your sense? What is your choice of medium? If, for example, you were to give out, say, some indicators, some insight, some directions, right? What would that be?
So, you know, I think it depends from brand to brand and category
Sure.
to category, right?
Mhm.
It can't be, there's no rule book for all brands because every brand is selling a proposition is different, right?
Sure.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, if you were to look at whether it's an FMCG brand or whether it's a clothing brand, a
Sure.
retail brand, or an automotive brand, the most important thing is what is a customer expecting from you.
Mhm.
If that is clear in your head while you do all the brainstorming and put your framework in, it
Sure.
becomes easy for you to pick up a platform.
Mhm.
Now, in my view, I think last 5 years or last 2 years, I would say, it's
Sure.
become very important to have technology as your base, which is your internal technology platform.
Mhm.
What it helps you with, I mean, you can't depend. So Facebook is not a medium now. It's a medium to engage, and it's
Right.
personal engagement. It's
Sure.
not for brands anymore. That's my
Mhm.
belief. It's not for Instagram. Is Of course it's a two-way communication. I think
Mhm.
Instagram has changed the way it moves now. For brands, YouTube, I still feel, because I think there are two things. One is video first was something which brands were using. Now it's going to become audio first.
Sure.
And that to me is very, very interesting because, see, because of this whole idea of working virtually, consuming so much content, people on the go, people are so busy, nobody has the time. Audio
Sure.
is something you're not getting distracted. You're listening. Whether you're running or whether you're in your car or whether you are, taking a cup of coffee and walking towards your office. I think brands who will adopt a strategy of audio first,
Sure.
um, that's going to be a game changer for our market,
Interesting.
in my view.
Right.
And third, if I were to just specify, would be, like I said, technology, audio first. And third most important thing, in my view, is when you pick up, we're all in the business of getting a business done, right?
Right.
Identifying that, is consumer wanting a two-way communication? Sometimes the
Right.
consumer does not want. So when you're sending a large message, which is on probably on corporate communication, you don't need a two-way communication. But when
Right.
it's a product, or when you're making an innovation where you want people to come together and give you inputs, that's a two-way. So you have to choose as to what what your idea is, who are
Right.
you talking to, and
Right.
then of course you can pick
And
the
then
mode of
calibrating it.
communication, calibrate. It can't be one-way street,
Right.
in my view. But technology, I think in-house technology and getting people who understand data. A lot of us didn't come from that background, right?
Right.
So really getting those people who are, I won't say data scientists, guy, but people who truly understand data, can dissect data, and then clearly say, this is how it's moving. You can't just look at data and say, oh my God, it's fancy, so many numbers. But what does it do for you? Is it
Right.
solving your business problem? It isn't, because you don't understand it. Hence, you really need
Interesting.
to, get people, whose mind bent is, they love numbers, who they
Right.
love analysis of data. And they're able to encapsulate that in one frame and say,
Interesting.
this is the problem, that's how we attack it.
Interesting. Pallavi, fun question, right? How difficult is all of this when you're communicating with leadership, right? A lot of what you're saying is not correct, quote unquote, right? And you know what I mean, right? How difficult is this to communicate, right? I was in a recent conversation with the founder, right? A fairly large one and a visible one, right? And he said, listen, TV is important for us because that helps us, people who buy our product think we are credible. All right. It's not as democratic. You have to have a certain war chest to be on TV, right? It was funny at that moment, but when I actually thought back, right, and looking back at his consumer base, right, his target audience, it kind of made sense. There's still a large part of India where being on TV just becomes so much more important, right? But coming back to the question, right, how difficult is all of this to evangelize in an environment which is rigid on occasions, inflexible? How difficult is all of this?
So, I think the most important thing, see, there are a lot of senior leaders who want to make a
Sure.
change. Yeah, they want to make a change, right?
Right.
Now, you have to also be intelligent and smart enough to understand where the person is coming from.
Mhm.
Most leaders want to take everybody together. Yeah,
Right.
they want to make a change. Now, see, the problem, say, if, for example, if I want something new to be done, now the,
Right.
the responsibility lies on my shoulder to convince my leadership, because
Right.
I think it's important. So
Right.
that's why I said that, the moment you start hiring people who want to take risk, who
Right.
have a very clear understanding of framework of the consumer, who do
Right.
their homework right, you can convince leadership.
Interesting.
Because ultimately, see, we're all people, and giving example, giving consumer insight, having the right data points, and don't talk on the basis of I think and I believe. Nobody wants to know what
Right.
you think, but
Right.
what does the consumer think? What is the data telling you? And
Right.
people, the leadership team will always listen. The leader is there to make the change
Right.
if you have the right way of making that change.
Right.
You know what
Interesting.
I'm saying?
Interesting. That's a very interesting point, Pallavi. Pallavi, I'm going to move into in through a conversation. You touched upon Bharat, right? On and that's the other narrative which is kind of picked up off late, right? Which is tier two and below, right? There is a lot of conversation that is happening. There are theses that are getting built, on all of that, right? I also have a thesis, which I think. Is kind of, it's important to understand Bharat, right? Because the narrative is kind of changing. Why am I excited about it is because the arbitrage between that existed, right? The physical arbitrage that existed between a tier A city and a tier two city and a tier three city, right? It's kind of gone away. You can now today engage with content, identify a brand, and very quickly go out and consume, right? The good part is that distribution channels have gotten established, right? Which essentially means that it's just about a few days before and few days later, right? For many, many brands to offer a similar experience, right? And I was with a founder who was based out of Raipur, right? Does about 150 crore plus of sales. And he said that, in a pre-COVID era, 20% of his business used to come from tier two cities and 80% used to be tier A cities, right? And during COVID, it's all reversed. And 80% of his business coming from tier two cities, tier three cities, and 20% is coming from tier A cities, right? Now that's a phenomenal change which we've experienced, right? And I'm sure you've also seen in many brands that you've been kind of working with. You must have seen this across data points, right? What is it that you make out of Bharat, right? Typically, for catering this market, there's been a one-way communication which has really worked. TV has been the channel to sort of go out and build that trust, credibility in the process, right? Eventually, sort of converting a lot of that into purchase. A lot that has changed. This entire segment is on mobile phones. They're consuming content, creating content far more than a tier A person could ever kind of think of, right?
Absolutely.
The inhibition is gone, right? The aspiration is speaking. They want it and they want it now, right? That's the new customer. This could be right, particularly for, say, a food product or an FMCG a little more, but I think that's also possibly true for many other such products, right? What do you make out of it? How do you read it? What kind of an opportunity do you think this is for brands to go out and build that relationship with, right? And also the criticality of speed and pace, because all of these people are consuming, they're all content first, right? In many ways. What's your sense of it? What do you read out of this?
So let me go back. Like you said, the gentleman said that two-tier market is where the business is coming from.
Sure.
More. So if you look at how the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, tier 4 markets are, smaller markets, tier 3, tier 4, even tier 2 markets are where business owners sit. Largely most business guys, right?
Sure.
And that's how the consumption would have increased more. When you come to the tier 1 cities, is more, people sitting, working for somebody, right? In the corporate sector or maybe something else. And that's how their consumption went down, because a lot of people, unfortunately, were not working with the companies they wanted to work. They're working with. A lot of things changed. And, and I think the second most important thing is that you're right, that mobile consumption content has increased much more. And if I look at data points, I still remember, when we would look at data points in my previous organizations, we would actually see the maximum amount of high purchase, which is high indulgence products, which are more than maybe, 20 lakhs, 30 lakhs, or even over 50 lakhs, are actually being bought by tier 2, tier 3 markets.
Sure.
And there is the real wealth actually of our country lies in those markets. The reason they were not exposed before was because of internet. Now, internet has changed everything for every single person. I mean, honestly, my staff, she's always ordering everything from Amazon. And she comes from a small town. She's not educated. She studied till class 4th or 5, and now she's 26 years old, and she does everything on her mobile. She orders everything on mobile. Vegetables, she said, Didi, let's order from grofers. And just so what I'm trying to say is that the India we live in today, and they think we can have same conversation because they do almost the same thing.
The exposure is now there. Right.
Exposure is much more. Hence, I think there are exciting times ahead, but it's very scary. It's also very scary because, especially for brands who are rigid, they'll have to really shake themselves up to be talking to the new consumers who would be very different. Today, for example, you go down south, right? You go to Chennai or you go to some parts of Kerala. They don't walk into a fancy showroom wearing fancy shoes and a belt, which is they walk in chappals. They walk in chappals and they'll say, take this 50 lakh rupees and I want this car. Right. Another consumer is very different, right? You cannot judge the consumer on the way they talk or they appear anymore.
Interesting. Pallavi, that's an interesting point that you got to highlight, right? Now, another important point in this conversation, right? And I think you're possibly the best suited person to answer this, right? Experiential has become just so much more important for all brands, right? Irrespective of whether they're traditional legacy brands or they're newer age brands, right? We're seeing this across the board, where every large brand is now going out and creating offline stores, right? And they're calling it experience stores. The idea is not to necessarily basically sell, right? But for somebody to come in and experience it, right? Because that possibly is going to lead into faster conversion, better conversion, and conversion, and more importantly, the trust that you kind of spoke of, right? Because we're still in many ways a touch and feel economy. We still pass on cultural aspects, right? I think that's going to completely go away, possibly when, say, kids who are 9 and 10 and 12 today, sort of come into the earning brackets, right? It'll possibly shift from there because these are kids who are born completely differently and consuming differently, right? But till then, I think touch and feel is going to be so much more important, right? What's your sense on experiential, right? How important do you think it's becoming in an economy with overload of information, right? Overload of content. Do you think that's going to really differentiate between the winner and the others in the game? What's your sense of it? Because, like I said, right, you're best suited for that. Automobile sales has been driven on experiential understanding and building that kind of an engagement, right? I mean, Harley is classical by doing many other things to ensure that consistency of experiences is phenomenal, right? Pre-purchase and post-purchase. What's your sense of it? How do you see it?
No, so I think, experience is the center of every brand in some ways,
Sure.
So, but what kind of experiential are you doing is also
Right.
very critical. And I think post-pandemic, if you see, there are people who are trying to get away so much and so much more. They don't want internet. The kind of things people, like ice climbing. Who thought in India people would do ice climbing during
Sure.
winters for New Year's? I hear people saying, I'm going ice climbing. I
Right.
want to go to this forest and climb. I want to, go to a place where there's organic farming, and I
Right.
want to spend time picking up the vegetables and cooking myself on my own. So this
Right.
is the new India. It's a very changed India where
Right.
they want some me time. Me time has become the most, which is maybe not with your husband, not with your boyfriend or girlfriend, not
Right.
with your parents, but just with yourself. Because
Right.
there is so much pressure for you to just perform in every sphere of your life,
Right.
right? So I think experience is actually going to become more and more important, and people are
Interesting.
ready to pay for it. People are ready on digital platforms. It's very
Sure.
difficult if you tell somebody, you pay for this and to join.
Right.
Very few people are going to do it. But you
Right.
tell somebody, I'm going to actually create a phenomenal experience on a race circuit for you. There'll be only 5 people who can come there. You'll have to
Right.
do this much to prepare yourself. You have to prove that you're the one we should call.
Right.
You'll have so many entries who will be ready to pay 40 grand, 50 grand just to be part of that experience. Because
Interesting.
ultimately it's a story you're going to tell to so many people.
Right.
When you're, in the evening, you're having a drink with your friend, you're like, by the way, I did that. It was a great experience.
Right.
You're not going to
Right.
say, I attended this
It's a
digital
talking point.
conference. Yeah, it's a great talking point. It helps you network better. So, so it's just experience. To me, experiential marketing is going to become a strength pillar for a brand. People will be ready to pay for it.
Right.
Look at Tomorrowland. I mean, Tomorrowland for 2 years have done all their events virtually. And of course, they had a lot of participants because they reduced the price of the ticket.
Right.
People want it because it's Tomorrowland. You have the best artists performing.
Right.
But the moment they announced that we will have a physical event, the amount of conversations and the love they got that we're waiting for it and you want to come to Tomorrowland and experience it is different. It's not that they didn't attend the virtual one, but the love they got for an experiential event was very different.
Interesting. Interesting. That's
So,
interesting, Pallavi. And I think a lot essentially what you're kind of saying, and I'm reading out of what you're sort of saying, is that irrespective of whatever content that you do, right, you'll have to translate a lot of that in a physical experience, right? It'll become it'll become an extension to the engagement that you're creating in the digital world, right? And physical is something which is just going to be so much more important and differentiating, right? In many ways, and it's going to become a talking point, right? And the beauty of doing something on the experiential side of it, right? You can build so many more conversations around it, right? You can engage people, which is very organic, right? Possibly also has a very significant impact on your overall cost of acquisition, right? At a larger level, which I kind of very strongly believe is going to become so much more critical as in the India of tomorrow that we see as things normalize. Pallavi, towards the end of our conversation, my second last question to you in this conversation is, what are the next 2 years like, right? What is it as a marketer, somebody who's experienced this transition, right? Who's experienced the change in mediums, who's experienced the change in mindset of a consumer, right? What is it that excites you? What is it that you anticipate in the next 2 years? I'd love to understand that.
So like I said, for me, I think it's so exciting to see that the mobility space is changing and there's so many new people and new players who are coming into the market who want to make the change. Yeah. And second, I think to me, like I said, is audio strategy, audio first. Brands were able to get it. and who are able to implement it and engage with their consumers is going to be very exciting in my view. And I think I'm
Interesting.
really looking forward for that. And third, to me, I feel that I think as marketers, there is a huge opportunity for us to become game changers now. We are
Right.
the growth drivers. We are the ones who are going to be the revenue drivers for the organization because we are so
Right.
close to the consumer.
Sure.
And technology platforms have helped us understand that data is proving that knowing your consumer to then delivering this end of the sale, the entire
Right.
the 50 touch points, 40 touch points are in the hands of a marketer.
Right.
Hence, you have to lead the growth functions. So there's a great opportunity for marketers today, but they have to learn, they have to change, they have to adapt, and go from a mindset of 5-6 things we've learned, but to say, let's learn from people who are from this day and age and who want to make a difference, and really nurture them and do something exciting. One of the dangers of out of home and television.
My last question in this conversation, it's you've answered it in a way. It's extremely cliched, right? But I go on to ask this question, right? What do you think, if you have to make any suggestions, advices, right, to the marketers who are going to cater to this aspirational India? I mean, we've always been aspirational, right? I think, but today we have the exposure which is required, right? Life of a marketer is just easier because they can, they're possibly experiencing themselves, right? If you were to give them an advice, right, on in terms of the skills that they're kind of required, and how should they possibly prepare themselves for this entire emerging consumption possibility, right? And we're and I love to say this, right? We're a large billion people market. It just makes it sound so much more sexy in many ways, right? But if you were to give that advice, what would that be? I'd love to, that as a takeaway message for many people. Many marketers are going to be watching this. What would that be?
I think most importantly, and I've been saying it for the longest of time, be thorough with your subject.
Right.
So thorough that you should know it end to end. You can't just, Google information and find something. You have to take down and really go into the depths of why, how, where, and what. Right. If that is very clear in your head, so being thorough is very, very important, because nowadays, we just want to Google everything and get things at a jiffy. But when you want to make change and when you really want to be at the forefront and you want to be differentiated, then you better know your product, your business, and more importantly, the landscape where you are, whatever you choose.
Right.
Be very thorough with it. Be knowledgeable. Just don't be informative, but be knowledgeable.
Interesting, Pallavi. On that, I'd love to thank you for taking the time out. This was a phenomenal conversation. And like I said, and possibly what I expected of this conversation, we are, I think, absolutely on track. That the transition and the change is just so much more pertinent, right? And I think, you've been a professional who's experienced all of it, right? I couldn't have asked for a better conversation. Of course, I would love to do many more of them. India is not an easy market. It's an extremely complicated market, right? We operate at many layers. We operate with a lot of cultural aspects, right? Baggages, tendencies that tend to get passed on, right, to generations, which are not going to change, right? And on the other side, we're becoming homogeneous, right? Because now we are essentially consuming from a predictable environment. We're not communicating or in a broken environment or consuming from a broken environment, right? Which used to be a marketer's nightmare. I think a lot of that is changing. I tend to differ with you on one or 2 points, right? And specifically on the audio point, because, with what we've seen on TikTok, right? It's democratized that creative sensibilities, right? Who would have thought that you give a tool in the hands of people and they'll go on to create content, right? My sense is drama continues to be a very pertinent part of our lives, right? And we'll continue to sort of live with that. Audio is definitely emerging as a play, but I think it's for an audience which has evolved at a certain level, right? A large part of India continues to still be very fancy in many ways, and I think we'll eventually graduate to that level. But I think that's the beauty that we deal with, and that's a billion people market that we live in, right? Pallavi, thank you so much for doing this. Loved it, and look forward to having you with much sooner. Wish you a happy Women's Day once again. This was, like I said, right, an extremely focused, powerful conversation, and the way you closed it was phenomenal, right? I think being thorough is just so much more important in a market which is so amazingly fast, right? You cannot live without being thorough. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much.